I call the meeting to order, this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 34 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to the order of reference of the House of Commons on Tuesday, February 24, 2026, the committee is meeting on Bill C-219, an act to amend the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade and Development Act, the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, Sergei Magnitsky Law, the Special Economic Measures Act, and the Broadcasting Act. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and also remotely using the Zoom application. I would now like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. From the Department of Canadian Heritage, we have Charlene Budnitsky, Senior Director, Communication, Legislative and Regulatory Policy. From the Department of Citizenship and Immigration, we have Tara Lang, Director General, Integrity Policy and Programs. And from the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, we have Robert Brookfield, Director General, Sanctions and Strategic Export Controls. We also have Kati Ksaba, Director General, Consular Affairs Bureau. And we also have Angelica Liao Moroz, Executive Director, Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions from colleagues. I now invite Mr. Brookfield to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Merci. Bon après-midi, honorable membres du
Thank you.
comité.
Good afternoon, honorable members of the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to speak on Bill C-219. The promotion and protection of human rights is a key priority for Canada. The laws that this bill seeks to amend play an important role in strengthening the Government of Canada's ability to respond effectively to serious violations and abuses committed abroad. Today, I will present some initial thoughts on potential areas for improvement in the bill.
Trade and Development Act. We welcome the requirement to publish an annual report outlining Canada's efforts to strengthen human rights globally. Such a report would be an opportunity to meaningfully capture the breadth of our engagement in this area. However, as presently proposed, we are concerned about a number of elements. First, we are concerned that divulging the names and details surrounding cases of individual human rights defenders, including Canadians, could put their safety at risk by the regimes that have detained them. As such, any list that the minister could publish, even with ministerial discretion, would in reality be a short list, not likely to satisfy the intent of the bill. Second, the bill uses the term prisoners of conscience. It would be preferable to follow Canada's long-standing practice of using the internationally recognized term of human rights defender when referring to individuals who peacefully advocate human rights. This approach is reflected in Voices at Risk, Canada's guidelines on supporting human rights defenders. Third, we have concerns that publishing a detailed list without distinguishing between foreign nationals, Canadian citizens, and permanent residents of Canada could have unintended negative consequences for the delivery of consular services to Canadian citizens. The bill also proposes amendments to the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act and the Special Economic Measures Act. I will comment on some key elements of those proposed amendments. First, the bill seeks to expand and clarify sanctions triggers, including in response to transnational repression. We consider that expanding the situations in which Canadian sanctions legislation can be used would be desirable, but would suggest that a broader expansion to allow for other situations, such as countering scam centres and cybercrime, would be preferable. Second, the bill would introduce visa restrictions for the immediate family members of sanctioned individuals, subject to limited exceptions. However, sanctioned individuals and their family members are already prohibited from entry under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, administered by the Minister of Public Safety. As such, creating an additional visa ban power would be duplicative and risks undermining the clear accountability of the Minister of Foreign Affairs for sanctions, while diluting existing accountabilities for inadmissibility decisions and weakening parliamentary oversight. We would suggest removing it. Third, the bill proposes rigid mandatory timelines for asset forfeiture and disposal. We consider that these timelines could undermine due process and international coordination and believe they should be removed. Fourth, the bill would mandate information sharing from the RCMP and FINTRAC and impose fixed timelines for sanctions decisions. While information sharing is essential, we believe that these measures would negatively impact the handling of sensitive intelligence and decision-making flexibility. As a result, we believe they should also be removed. Finalement, le projet de loi propose des modifications à la...
Finally, the bill suggests amendments on the Broadcasting Act, which would require the immediate revocation of a broadcasting license where a broadcaster operating in Canada is found to be under the significant influence of a foreign person or entity that is subject to Canadian sanctions or has committed genocide. This legislation does not fall under Global Affair Canada's mandate. But Canadian Heritage notes that the provision raises concerns regarding a lack of proper process, a defined role for the CRTC, and clarity around key concepts such as vulnerability to significant influence and evidentiary standards.
Range of legislative frameworks that underpin Canada's efforts to promote and protect human rights and to hold perpetrators of serious violations accountable. While the bill advances objectives that Canada strongly supports, several of the proposed amendments would raise important legal, operational, and coordination questions, including with respect to due process, existing authorities, and effective implementation across government. As the committee considers this bill, Global Affairs Canada would encourage careful consideration of how proposed changes can best reinforce the effectiveness, coherence, and credibility of Canada's sanctions and human rights tools. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for your statement. I will now open the floor to questions, beginning with MP James Bezan. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the officials for appearing today. I want to ask you your definition of family member that you want to see put in the legislation rather than using the term immediate family member. Is that taken from the Immigration Refugee Protection Regulations?
Well, to clarify, our preference would be that we rely on the Immigration, Refugee, and Protection Regulations, but I'll let my colleague elaborate on that point.
So under that definition, family members is limited to a spouse, dependent child, a dependent child of a dependent child, and then, you know, a definition of what a dependent child is, that being under 22 years of age. You understand that the problem that we have is that corrupt foreign officials are bringing their adult children here to hide themselves along with the illicit wealth that has been gained. And I prefer using the immediate family definition out of the Canadian Labour Standards regulations, which says that immediate family is the employee's spouse or common law partner, the employee's father or mother, and the spouse of the common law partner, or father or mother, employee's children, employee's spouse, the grandchildren, brothers, sisters, grandfather, grandmother of the individual, the spouse of the common law. So it's adult children, it's siblings. You know, that to me better protects Canada from being used as a safe haven by these corrupt foreign officials and gross human rights violators that we're trying to stop. Wouldn't you agree with that?
So I would suggest that under the current legislation that we have for sanctions, any of those individuals could already be named and sanctioned very specifically. So the slippery slope in the space of an expanded family definition is that from a visa processing perspective, what we receive from a sanction perspective is the name of the sanctioned individual. We do not receive, or it's impossible to possibly calculate, the brother-in-law, the grandmother, the sister, the aunt, the uncle. So when a visa officer receives an application and it would say, you know, James Bezan, sanctioned individual, you're inadmissible.
Russia so far, don't. let's not go beyond that.
But say you have an adult son who might already be in Canada. Because of that, the visa officer wouldn't have that information at their disposal. The purposeful definition of family member works for IRPA. And if the purpose is to truly sanction individuals who might be benefiting from a regime or unscrupulous practices, then that individual should be named. And those family members who are associated shouldn't be painted with that same brush. I think there's charter implications there, but more so, you're risking the potential person getting into Canada because visa officers couldn't possibly know all the family relations of all a sanctioned individual unless they're named.
I think it would get maybe a little more difficult, especially when you start talking about, you know, girlfriends, boyfriends, you know, intimate partners, that type of stuff. But I think with family members, you know, it doesn't take long to research. You know, if it's somebody coming from the Iranian regime, as an example, that we'd be able to say, okay, this is a brother that potentially is even here to do that background research. And I guess, some of this comes down to, do you guys have enough resources at hand, or should you be allocated more resources to actually be able to enforce the sanctions from the standpoint of a travel ban or a visa ban that's being put in place?
Yeah, again, I don't think this is a question of resources. On an application, again, family members as defined in IRPA is that tight definition. And the reason for that is that down the line, if we have a tight definition, then if somebody comes in, they can't therefore sponsor their uncle or their cousin. If the intention is really to keep people out of Canada, then they should be sanctioned individually. So I would recommend that under the current regime, that can be done, and that is what should be done to protect Canadian society.
Okay. You mentioned, Mr. Brookfield, that also you didn't like the use of the term prisoners of conscience, human rights defenders. Where does that definition come from? And you're saying that is a Canadian tradition. I don't find it anywhere. And if you look at, this prisoner of conscience is Amnesty International was the one that coined the term. I think it aligns with what we've always talked about as parliamentarians. We're talking in the House, when we're in debate, when we're here at committee. When you look at the legislation that came up in the last Parliament from my colleague, Mr. Lawrence, it was actually with the NDP that we added in this definition of prisoner of conscience that passed at third reading before it was sent off to the committee with this terminology in there. Just because you guys prefer one terminology doesn't mean that prisoner of conscience isn't better.
Let my colleague answer.
Okay. Thanks very much for the question. So we have long used the term human rights defender, and perhaps I'll take a minute to just explain how we differentiate that versus the term prisoners of conscience. So when we talk about a human rights defender, we're referring to people or groups who peacefully, the key word is peacefully, promote and protect human rights. And we prefer this broader definition because it focuses very much on the role and the activities of the individual as opposed to prisoners of conscience, which can be a subset of human rights defenders, but that term focuses more on their custodial situation as opposed to what they are doing and what they are advocating. And what I would say is that the term human rights...
I mean, just interrupting, but where in legislation do we currently use that term in Canada?
Okay. So it's an internationally agreed upon concept. It stems from the UN, from the United Nations. There are a number of recurring UN resolutions. So it's widely used in the UN system by many member states, by regional organizations. And it is a term that we have used in government to guide our engagement, including in our official guide that we provide to our officials abroad when detailing how they should be supporting and protecting human rights defenders abroad.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Van Dellenveld. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions, but I just some clarification on that last one about human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience. Human rights defenders is a broader category, correct? Because once a prisoner is released, they may still be under surveillance, they may still be targeted, their family might be targeted, but they're not technically a prisoner of conscience anymore. But if they're a human rights defender, then that would actually capture a larger group of people?
Yes, thank you very much for that clarification. That's exactly right. The point that we are trying to make isn't, it's not a personal preference of one terminology or the other. It's more to have very much that inclusivity. So when we talk about prisoners of conscience, the mind goes to somebody who's detained, who's being imprisoned. When we talk about human rights defenders, we're talking about the broad spectrum of defenders. They can be journalists, they can be Indigenous leaders, they can be business associates, they can be youth, they can be students. And it's not just about what their custodial arrangement is, but they could be facing any number of threats, intimidation, surveillance, etc. So it goes beyond that narrower lens of detention and imprisonment.
Okay, thank you. And my question is for Mr. Brookfield. So you outlined a number of areas where you have concerns about the bill, but this bill also modernizes our our Magnitsky sanctions regime, updates it, expands it in a number of areas, including transnational repression, which I think is something that probably wasn't as exposed as it is now when that first bill came through. So could you tell us what the good things are in this bill?
I'd highlight, as you did also, that the ability to have broader opportunity under the Special Economic Measures Act in particular to deal with transnational repression is potentially quite helpful. One of the challenges between the Special Economic Measures Act and the JVC FAAE is the evidence required to list is a bit more specific. So having a broader trigger both with respect to transnational repression, as I mentioned perhaps in other topics, would allow us greater latitude so that we don't necessarily need to have evidence of a specific individual engaging in specific human rights abuse, but rather a more general linkage between a problem that is being occurred and the individual's contribution to that problem, as we do in other areas, for example, sanctions against Russian oligarchs.
And you said this could be even further broadened. Cybercrime was one of the things you mentioned. What would those areas be?
Well, the one that I think would particularly highlight is scam centers. So in November of last year, both the United States and the United Kingdom at the same time issued sanctions under their human rights legislation, essentially, or human rights sanctions regime, against a place that's called the Prince Group. They're located in Cambodia, and they're involved in abducting and doing scams within the area and more internationally. Then later on this year, in fact, South Korea did the same thing for the first time. They had autonomous sanctions against that same group. We in Canada could not put sanctions on that group without doing a Cambodia sanctions, because the trigger for doing sanctions on the Special Economic Measures Act requires a link to the country. Another example is cybercrime. So we did, for example, list a group in Kyrgyzstan called A7A5. They were a conduit for Russian funding. We're able to link them because we were able to link them to Russia and Russia's support of the war against Ukraine. But had we wanted to go against a unit that was not directly linked to the war against Ukraine or the Russian government, we would have challenges. The United Kingdom, for example, has sanctioned cybercrime actors in Russia, not necessarily linked to the regime or to activities in Ukraine, but linked to activities against the United Kingdom directly. And so those are the sort of areas where our allies have that flexibility, and we think it would be helpful if we had it as well.
Thank you. I think that's something we could certainly reflect on. I was a little bit confused when you said about the unintended consequences of the annual publication of all of the consular cases we're working on. You said that because of the difference between permanent residents, citizens, and foreign nationals, that might, I think your words were, it would have unintended consequences to our consular services. How?
Happy to speak on that front. So the bill does not distinguish currently between foreigners, Canadian citizens, some of whom might be dual citizens, and permanent residents of Canada. Whenever a Canadian finds themselves detained abroad, they become automatically eligible for consular services. And so what can happen is that by publicly disclosing that they are in this situation and by publicly criticizing the government, it can actually make it more difficult for us to then have consular access to those individuals. Normally, we would seek to do prison visits, to be able to check on the well-being of those Canadian citizens. But if we are sort of out there publicly naming and shaming, as much as I know there are other good reasons for doing that, but it can make it very difficult then to be able to support Canadian citizens who find themselves in that situation. And not just those who are named on the list, but any other Canadian citizens who also happen to be detained in the same country, because ultimately, we have to have some degree of cooperation with local officials in order to be able to access those Canadians.
And what about the publication, the unintended consequences that it could actually put those individuals in more danger if it's publicized?
Indeed, because by naming them and exposing the fact that we consider them to be human rights defenders, it makes them, in a sense, potentially more of a valuable target for the regime of the country that is holding them. So they may actually end up treating them even more badly because they know that they are someone that we are seeking to protect.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We go next to Monsieur Duceppe. You have 6 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. And Thank you to the witnesses for being here to discuss this bill, which is supported by the Bloc Québécois. But there are a few explanations that we'd like to have, maybe some issues in terms of the enforcement of this act as it's drafted. And I think that people are open that we do further work on it to improve it. So this bill asks for an annual report with information on political prisoners, but in terms of the administration processes, how does your department see the gathering of information, the data, and what's really important is the interaction with families? Thank you very much for the question. First of all, the government encourages the publication of transparent and relevant reports on efforts made by Canada to further human rights on the international scale.
We feel should be an opportunity to focus on our overall strategic priorities when it comes to human rights, our actions, and the outcomes. And the reason you asked about, what level of effort would this take? The way the draft bill is currently worded, it requires us to provide not just a listing of individual defenders who are detained abroad, but details regarding their circumstances. You obviously read the bill, how often we've intervened with the local government, etc. That would be a vast amount of resources and efforts deployed to constantly monitoring these cases, verifying this information, and also from just a purely information management perspective, ensuring the integrity and the privacy and the security of this information. So the reason why we would like to reframe it as a report on Canada's broader human rights priorities are because it's a way to show the full spectrum of work that we're doing, whether it's, specific geographic areas of concern, whether we're talking about human rights defenders, transnational repression, other trends, whether we are doing this through country-to-country engagement, whether it's through our work at the United Nations, whether it's through funding, programming for civil society and human rights defenders, whether it's through imposing consequences such as sanctions for countries who have very concerning human rights records, or through our engagement of civil society. And so our assessment is that for the reasons already explained regarding principally safety and privacy of the individual, perhaps one way to do so would be to highlight what we call emblematic cases of particular individuals abroad where it signifies a broader trend on a particular issue of concern, as opposed to going detailed case by case.
Je comprends, vous êtes allé beaucoup plus large que...
I understand that it's much, you went much further than what I wanted. I was trying to really focus on the interaction with the families, which is what concerns me most, because this would allow the disclosure of information and would let the minister exclude some information related to families, but I have some fears. Wouldn't it be better that the Act would seek to get the opinion of the families of the political prisoners before publishing their names or other information about them? So I'm wondering what it would mean if we asked for the previous consent of the family. Would that complicate your work, or would it make it easier? So really doing the opposite of what's in the current bill, to get the opinion of the families before disclosing information and not having that as a job of the minister. The problem is that even with that change, we anticipate that we won't be able to communicate many names because we have fears about disclosure of the information. So if we can discuss with some family members, who would it be? The brother, the sister, the father? there will not be a decision of issuing the information because it would be difficult to find it. And one might find someone who doesn't agree, here or the prisoner. But currently, there are many families who would approve such a decision. I think several of my colleagues here work with families of political prisoners who are asking us to do that. That being said, there are also families who are asking us to work more discreetly, not have such a public presence. So we're trying everything that can work when it's not public. If it doesn't work, then we can choose to go public by focusing on a specific case. So Jimmy Lai, others, there are several families who initially wanted to do things very quiet for the two Michaels, for example, but then finally that was made public. So my question is quite simple. It's to not necessarily leave that responsibility to the minister, but to have the preliminary consent. And I know you have concerns about who decides what within a family, how to proceed, but there must be a way of creating parameters that would lead us to an obvious decision-making for cases that aren't too complicated. Are you following me?
Okay. Merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you very much for the question. And you're right, it's always preferable to have the consent of the person or of their family. But I would say that there are other principles that we have to respect.
We have to assess that disclosing the name and circumstances of an individual, regardless of their consent, whether or not that will put their safety at risk for any number of reasons, along with others that I can elaborate subsequently.
MP Bazan, we start the next round with 5 minutes from you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to come back. Would you guys be opposed to having both a definition of human rights defenders and a definition for prisoners of conscience that are different?
Not necessarily, just off the cuff. I think that as long as we have that broader definition of human rights defenders, as I said, so we can be as inclusive as possible, and we could recognize that.
So tell me this on human rights defender, because I'm looking at the GAC line on this, and who are human rights defenders, and it's saying that someone who individually or with others acts to promote and protect human rights defenders document and call attention to violations, abuses by any actors, including governments, businesses, non-state actors. So, that's what you're defining it as. But then what do you do with the people that are getting arrested and detained and often sterilized, like the Uyghurs, the Falun Dafa? You think about the Tibetan monks, like they're all being ostracized, prosecuted, and executed based upon religion, not that they're out there fighting for freedom.
Or
because they don't fall under our definition of a human rights defender.
No, and I would say that just because they don't fall under a definition of the human rights as a human rights defender doesn't necessarily mean that we're not advocating in other ways. But if I may first answer your initial question, I don't think we would be opposed to including the subcategory of prisoners of conscience. It's not out of disliking the term. It's very much, as I said, to go much wider in scope. And so, the example that you just described, where an individual is peacefully standing up for rights, regardless of, so in this case, the right to the freedom of religion or belief, we would consider that to be a human rights defender.
Yeah, but they're just getting arrested based upon their belief. They're not actually, they're just practicing their faith. Or you take, people like Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was just standing up for democracy. Yeah. And right now under human rights defender, maybe that falls in, but I think prisoners of conscience, fits better. So I think maybe we should be looking at, look at my colleagues across the way, and when we start working on amendments, that possibly we kind of do the combination, make sure both terms are used, so that we are inclusive and specific enough that nobody slips through the cracks. You'd be okay with that?
Yes, and I think the one thing I would add is that in this case, somebody who is exercising their freedom of religion or belief, there are also. This is not to say that we don't advocate for these type of rights. We very much do. For example, Canada has long led an international contact group on freedom of religion or belief, so working with 20-plus states, the UN and elsewhere, to really make sure that these issues are front and center when we're talking about human rights. So there are many ways in which we do this. I understand your particular point in that if somebody is detained, that they're not left behind. And I think we would be open to reflecting on this just to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible.
So talking about the privacy concerns around the reporting, and I understand that some families may not want to, but I know that in my conversations with Michael Korvig, I know that, if you look at, and I know that we have Brandon Silver up next, and he'll probably talk about Irwin Kotler's comments as it goes to actually shining the spotlight. And Korvig's told me this, Vladimir Kara-Murza's told me that if their situations hadn't been brought to the forefront and they were just forgotten about behind, bars, they most likely would have been executed. So, how do we balance this off where we know that sunshine is the best disinfectant, that we can shine that sunlight into governments that are, really trying to repress those individuals that they have captured, imprisoned based upon political belief, religious belief. Jimmy Lai is another one. As my colleague Brunel Sepp talked about. How do we make sure that those individuals, we shine the spotlight? Otherwise, who knows what could get worse.
Thanks. It's a very fair point, and if I may elaborate on what I said previously. There are cases, you're absolutely right, where shining a spotlight will help. And, in many of these situations, we also like to work with partners. There's strength in numbers. It brings more visibility to a case. I can think of one example. You talked about Jimmy Lai, for example. We, at the Human Rights Council not too long ago, stood up alongside New Zealand and Australia and other partners and brought to light the most recent details concerning this case. What we're trying to say is that a blanket approach where we would have to list, in detail the names of the individuals and the circumstances around their detention. There are situations where we do assess that, shining a public light on them, regardless of whether or not they've provided consent, would actually backfire. It could lead to reprisals by the host state. It could.
Thank you. We go next to MP Oliphant. You have 5 minutes.
Just before I begin my time, I'd like to do a point of order. I didn't want to interrupt the previous person, so before my time begins, I want clarification that it would be, and I believe I'm correct on this, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on discussion with the previous bill about discussion around the definitions of human rights defenders or prisoners of conscience that took place in camera and agreements that might have been reached the last time because it was an in-camera meeting, so I'm not able to bring that up here at this meeting. Am I correct on that?
You are correct on that.
Am I able to bring it up at an in-camera meeting at a later date?
I believe so, yes.
When we, clause by clause, was in camera. Oh, it wasn't in camera. Okay, then I can, because there were discussions among the parties at that point around this, which I thought we had reached consensus on. But I will want to look at the transcript just to prove to myself. I'm very careful about privilege on those issues. So I want to be very careful. All right, thank you. Thank you to the witnesses and for not just today, but for coming back again and for the work you do all the time. Ms. Zaba, how many consular cases do we have a year approximately?
We have, of all kinds, we have over 7,000 consular cases a year.
And complex, problematic cases that would require a variety of higher level interventions?
That's over 7,000 would include anything that is more complicated than, let's say, a passport renewal. But of that, it would be a much smaller number. It depends really by country, but
600 a year?
Let's say something like that.
And complex cases with prison, threat of capital punishment, 100 a year?
With threat of capital punishment, I would say less than 30 or
Okay. So, but these are complex cases that you need to follow and you need attention on and with limited resources. Am I also right in assuming that our consular engagement sets a priority for Canadian citizens?
Absolutely. Consular services are only available for Canadian citizens.
And in our missions, we would have that as a priority as well.
Yes.
So we'd be very cautious to do something that could undermine our work for Canadian citizens, which is a point that was being made, that we would want to be delicate in our strategic interventions around human rights defenders or prisoners of conscience who may not be Canadian citizens if it jeopardizes a Canadian citizen in a either similar or different. I mean, we have people who do bad things. They may not be prisoners of conscience. They may just be crooks who are in jail, but we still help them.
Absolutely. We still want to offer as much consular assistance as possible, advocate for their well-being.
And listing activities by country and by name of person could threaten that work, in your opinion?
It could indeed, in our opinion, threaten that work and put at risk other Canadians who might be held in the same country and who would be equally affected by the country's dissatisfaction with us naming them publicly.
And when we're dealing with a consular case and we're dealing with family members who are not the consular case themselves, what power of agency does the family have versus the individual?
Actually, thank you for that opportunity. I did want to raise an important point around the role of the Privacy Act, because for any Canadian citizen who is arrested abroad, who might fall within this category or not, any Canadian citizen is then considered to be a consular client, and the Privacy Act then comes into play. And under the Privacy Act, a family member actually cannot allow for the divulgation of personal information. It is only the consular client.
The family of Jimmy Lai decided to go public with the case, or Jimmy Lai went public with the case. That would be different than the government of Canada going public with what we are doing to support Jimmy Lai in incarceration.
Indeed, although Jimmy Lai is not a Canadian citizen, but yes.
I know, but his family who are Canadians, so we have a concern for him. We've raised it many times, and we have raised it at the highest levels, internationally, bilaterally. But it was the choice of his family to raise that, and his personal choice, as he's spoken a number of times previously.
And there have been cases where we have chosen to speak very publicly. The case of the two Michaels has already been raised. That was a situation where the government felt that it was in the best interests of those two individuals, and because we had access to them in China, they were able to give us that permission to raise their cases publicly, and we did so.
Those are strategic case-by-case decisions as opposed to a blanket or universal decision.
Absolutely.
So a blanket or universal requirement to do that could limit our ability to be strategic country by country, or even engaging a third country if we felt they had a better relationship with the host country, or that we may want to engage them as opposed to doing it ourselves to find a more successful route for that. Am I correct in that?
Yes, yes, you are.
And we do that regularly. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll keep going if I can. With respect to transnational repression, and I'm pleased that you are looking into this and to expanding perhaps the scope on this. We may try to come up with an amendment. Why hasn't the government come up with legislation that might do that? I'm just
Very brief response.
Well, as a humble functionary, I don't think it's my position to suggest what the government or parliament should or should not have done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We go next to MP Alexis Brunel-Duceppe. You have 2.5 minutes.
Merci. J'aurais aimé poser la même
Thank you.
question.
I was going to ask the same question as Rob. Rob's question to Rob. So, in terms of the part of the Broadcasting Act that's affected in this law, the English version of 219 in that part is identical as the one in the C291, but the French version of C219 on the subject of the Broadcasting Act is slightly different. Have you identified these differences? Do you see any differences that might have an impact on the legal interpretation? Yes, thank you for the question. We could think about this because we would like to have a translation that's completely correct. But thank you for raising this point, and we can discuss that further. So in that case, would you recommend that we would adjust it so that it is faithful to the spirit of what was written? Okay, that's very good. So we'll do it when we do the clause-by-clause study. I think it will be relatively easy to arrive at a consensus. So it's C-281. The Broadcasting Act is the same, but not the English one. As I said earlier, we're having problems with the text in English as well. So if it goes ahead, it should be equal. Another excellent answer. So I'd like to speak about the Broadcasting Act. There's their issue in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of Canada's international obligations. So how does that fit into the the existing framework in terms of freedom of expression, or freedom of speech? It's a very good question. Thank you very much. And if you allow me to, I'll explain in English. Thank you.
Possible. I'd like to just back up a little bit on that to give un peu plus de contexte, si c'est possible. Okay, so
A little more context, if possible.
Is a very important point, and it links back to the whole discussion about the concept of vulnerability to significant influence, and this being extremely ambiguous, and it doesn't really give clear guidance to the Commission, which could ultimately impact freedom of expression by having a chilling effect on Canadian broadcasters avoiding or limiting certain non-Canadian programming, or effectively not entering into commercial relationships with broadcasters or other associated businesses, even if there is no idea of any sort of influence, to avoid a compliance risk.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP James Bezan. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll just continue on this path to just get more of those concerns. Like, you think it's going to be, I'm a freedom guy. That's why I brought forward this bill, because we're standing up for freedom for everybody around the world. And of course, freedom of expression is something that we're concerned about, and some discussions that we had internally when we're bringing this forward. I think that we're being fairly specific. It's that the House or the Senate has made a recommendation that, a certain country's been carrying out an atrocity, a genocide. They call it as such. I look at how long it took us to get RT, Russia Today, off the air. That these things should happen quicker. And then, if we decide to sanction a broadcasting entity because they are being propaganda machines for a corrupt regime and committing gross human rights violations, then should we not then automatically, through that process, again, trigger them being taken off our airways? Isn't that really what this says quite clearly, rather than muddling the waters around freedom of expression?
That's a really good question, in the sense that we have to understand what is the regulatory powers of the CRTC, as well as the non-Canadian programming services that I think we're talking about when we're talking about the aim of the bill to prevent the proliferation of propaganda in the Canadian broadcasting system. So if you would allow me, I'll talk first about the regulatory aspects, and then talk about what it looks like to identify non-Canadian programming services.
In a short period of time.
Sure, I'll do it very quickly. Fair enough. So the bill would only impact directly licensed broadcasters. So these are Canadian-owned and controlled broadcasters. The bill does not impact the CRTC's authorization process for non-Canadian services or online broadcasters, as these are not licensed broadcasters. So the CRTC has the authority to remove or add non-Canadian services to or from an approved list called the list of non-Canadian programming services authorized for distribution. These are not licenses. This is just the authority to distribute in Canada.
Tell me, how does it work then, like with RT? Because they were broadcasting on the air using Canadian cable companies, didn't they have to get a license to do that?
They didn't have to get a license to do that. No, they would be carried through the authorized distribution list. And here's another.
How then was the directive issued then for cable companies, satellite companies to take them off the air?
So then the CRTC would have a hearing as part of its due process to decide whether or not a station, a channel like RTTV should be carried as part of the authorized distribution list. So it can remove or add channels to that list.
So when we look at communist China, and we've already recognized that what they've done to the Uyghurs is a genocide. CCTV, communist Chinese television carried on Canadian Airways. They don't need a license. You're saying it's the carriers have made that decision.
The Canadian broadcasters who are licensed, they're the ones that can pick up programming services from the authorized distribution list for distribution in Canada. But there's one very important point to add to that as well, and that is that even if they're excluded from the authorized distribution list, like CCTV, CGTN, the reality is that if the programming service is available online or it is available through a website, Canadians would still be able to access that content.
And we specifically left that out. Just to go back again to issues around privacy concerns. This week, is Iran Accountability Week, where we've actually are shining the spotlight on a number of prisoners of conscience and human rights defenders, if we're going to do both, in Iran. Some of them have connections to Canada, some do not. So as we go down this path, fighting for people that are recognized as being standing up for women, life, and freedom, standing up against the regime, and we're getting arrested, 50,000 arrested on the streets of Tehran before the entire war broke out. What so where there is Canadian connections, maybe they're dual citizenship, maybe they're permanent residents. How does that impact on us making sure that there is transparency? Families want these, again, the sunlight in. So how do we make sure that that's happening without bringing up the concerns of privacy?
A very brief response.
Perhaps I can start and then turn to my colleague for any
no,
consular.
we won't be able to do that.
Okay.
You'll have to finish, please.
I mean, my colleague has already spoken to, the consular implications for or considerations for Canadians, so maybe I'll focus on the other aspects. When we talked about unintended consequences, let's say that we have the consent of an individual or their family and they want us to go public or they want us to raise it with the host government. That is definitely one consideration. It's one of three top considerations when we think about how we go about securing their release and defending them. The other two considerations are, that human rights are universal, so they apply to all. I think that's a concept understood by all. And then the last principle is that we do not endanger them further. And it comes down to...
Sorry, we'll have to stop there.
Okay.
Next is Monsieur Guilbeault. You have 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Pardon, merci, Monsieur le
Thank you
Président.
very
Merci.
much, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses. I would like to come back to the issue about the Broadcasting Act, and particularly about two things. And I'd like to ask you if you can give us more details. You did start to explain in English earlier. Excuse me. And the second thing is that the CRTC has power over the traditional broadcasters, but not through online broadcasters. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. So a lot that what we might want to seek to put an end to with the clause in this bill, it's that propaganda is being carried out more and more on online media and social media. So the CRTC's powers would be excessively limited in trying to contain all that, if that's the goal we're trying to pursue. Yes, absolutely. It was well described. The powers of the CRTC are limited because they only apply to traditional broadcasters.
Applies to traditional broadcasters. So these are Canadian-owned and controlled broadcasters. They are not the online, as I said before, they are not online broadcasters. They are not non-Canadian programming services that the CRTC controls or licenses. It's only through the authorized list for non-Canadian services for distribution, through which those sorts of programming decisions would be made, and then they would be picked up by Canadian traditional broadcasters.
Donc, si on voulait essayer de mettre en place un régime pour
So
tenter
if we
de...
wanted to put in place a regime to seek to try and slow down or limit the possibility, as my conservative colleague said, of certain countries to spread this propaganda, we would need a totally different regime that would specifically apply to online media and platforms. Yes, you're right. We would need several kinds of amendments in this bill, or have an entirely different act to deal with what you've proposed. Chair, I'm having problems with my throat, so I asked the questions I had to ask. So if someone on my side wants to speak now, I'm happy to stop there. Thank you. Well, I'll take it, Stephen. I didn't know that Mr. Giuseppe had changed his political allegiance during this meeting. Mr. Giuseppe.
Sure. Just following up on the good parts of this bill, which I think there are several, and the difficult parts of this bill, would it be easier for us to write a new bill, or would it be, is it, in your mind, is this bill fixable to understand that we have common goals, and that is to uphold human rights in the world, and to show Canada's defense of human rights in the world, and to be practical help to human rights defenders. This is what we want to do. We don't have anything. My concern is there are parts of this bill that could hinder that work as opposed to help it. And I'm wondering whether we can fix it, how we fix it, and whether or not there are things here that we're actually not thinking about, that are not in the bill, that you have kind of had on your wish list that government should be doing, that this is your chance to tell parliamentarians, is there something that you think that we're missing that would aid in that work, whether it's on transnational repression, whether it's on human rights defenders or prisoners of conscience, should we go that limited way, or is it with respect to how we navigate a difficult world with some despotic regimes that don't share our values on human rights? Are there measures that you would be recommending that we should be considering?
Well, perhaps I can start, and my colleagues can add if they see more. I think, as I tried to make clear in my opening statements, I think there's two key elements of this bill that we do think are very valuable. The idea of doing human rights reporting, as my colleagues have elaborated on, we think would be very useful under the constraints that we've set forth. And as I mentioned, I think the elements of this bill that expand the trigger to include transnational repression, perhaps more, which would allow our sanctions regime to be fit for purpose, would be very helpful. There are other elements of it that I elaborated on in my open comments that are procedurally challenging and would impede our work, and if those could be removed, that would certainly be helpful.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we'll have to keep going. Mr. Chong, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to ask about Madame Budnitsky about the Broadcasting Act changes in the bill. So I agree with you that this doesn't address the issue of RT and other authoritarian state-controlled broadcasters like CGTN because they're not licensed. They are on the list of non-Canadian programming services and stations authorized for distribution. So, point taken. But wouldn't you agree that one way to amend the Act would be to use Section 7 of the Broadcast Act, which gives the minister the power to issue directives to new broadcasting policies of general application, and that the bill be amended to, or that amendment be introduced, or that something be done that effectively issues a new broadcast policy of general application that authoritarian state-controlled broadcasters not be on the list of non-Canadian programming services and stations authorized for distribution. Wouldn't you agree that that would be the way to go about doing this?
Let me back up a little bit here. I want to talk a little bit about RTTV and what happened in that case. Is that?
I know what happened there.
Okay.
They issued a directive under Section 15,
Yeah.
basically nudge, nudge, CRTC, hold a hearing. And the CRTC concluded that RT should be pulled off the waves. I think we need to be a bit more categoric about authoritarian state-controlled broadcasters, not just RT. I think CGTN should have been pulled at the same time. So that's why I'm suggesting Section 7 or some derivative thereof to proceed then in that fashion. Because I think what the intent of the drafters of the bill here is to do is to get authoritarian state-controlled broadcasters off our airways. And I would disagree with you on one thing. It's not the same as the internet. Because long-standing Supreme Court rulings have said that the broadcast system, as regulated by the CRTC, is a public entity. It is owned by the Government of Canada, and we are under no obligation to allow, authoritarian state-controlled broadcasters use of publicly owned airwaves, which is what they are. That's very different and distinct than the internet or the publication of books or, newspapers or distribution of materials. These are public airwaves. They're owned by the public. They're owned by the Government of Canada. And so, the Government of Canada, in my view, is well within its rights to determine what goes on those airwaves and what doesn't. That's why we have a whole Canadian content policy that's been in place for decades. We don't do that to newspapers or to other private forms of media. So, I think that's a distinction that I would make.
With respect to Section 7, we'd be issuing a policy direction, and that is something that would continue ad infinitum until it was actually repealed in any way, shape, or form, brought back in any way, shape, or form. Yes, I suppose there could be a Section 7 that would be issued, but it's really sort of a very direct and maybe even a little bit of a heavy approach to dealing with removing non-Canadian programming service from the airwaves. Section 15 is not as permanent. It is less directive. It does have its value. In the case of RTTV, you've said yourself, was removed almost immediately once that was issued. So, there are different ways to do things. Absolutely, the desired approach would be something that would be a little less directive, I think, in this case.
I didn't when the directive under Section 15 was issued, I did not expect any results other than what transpired after the hearing. To be frank, I think when the Cabinet or when the Minister of Canadian Heritage issues a directive like that, it's pretty clear what the CRTC is expected to do. That's just my commentary on that. But I think, I think there's a distinction between publicly owned airwaves, which are licensed, over which we long have determined editorial or content direction, Canadian content rules being, the most famous of those. And, free speech, free expression rights is protected generally, but, throughout the civil domain of our society. I think that's a separate and distinct issue. But we appreciate your feedback on it. You've pointed out an important change that needs to be made to the bill if we are to get authoritarian state-controlled broadcasters off our airwaves. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Back to Mr. Oliphant. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you again. I want to get into the part of the bill that I understand the least and know the least about. And that is the sections 8, 9, clauses 8, 9, 16, and 17 with respect to FinTrack and RCMP and information sharing and those requirements. And I guess I don't know the current state of information sharing that happens. What are we lacking at Global Affairs that could actually help with the sanctions impositions, and what potential problems could this cause?
Well, obviously, FINTRAC and RCMP aren't here, so I'll do my best to pass on what I understand to be their perspective on this. And certainly from Global Affairs' perspective, we do work very closely with FINTRAC and RCMP. There are very tight authorities under FINTRAC on what they can report and not. And they, in fact, recently did a fine of $175 million against a cryptocurrency exchange in BC, in part based on failure to reduce sanctions reporting. So they do a very important job, but they don't assess. They're not a law enforcement tool. They're not used for. They have very limited constraints for charter and constitutional reasons. So this particular provision is problematic for them as for the RCMP in that it requires them to take on a role of judge, in a sense, that is not their role. And the RCMP has the same concerns. Similarly, for the RCMP, we work closely with them for enforcement side, but they don't assess the policy question of whether individuals are not doing, for example, committing genocide.
It would seem to be quite difficult. I turned back my clock, unfortunately, to a time when I was in opposition, and we had cases where RCMP relayed information with respect to Canadians who were incarcerated in Syria based on incorrect information from the RCMP, and that information was not shared appropriately, and there were consequences for the government at that time, and reparations were made. So I'm very worried about giving any sort of non-enforcement or non-operational activity to those two agencies that really are enforcement agencies. They can have red flags, as you say. They can assert that there is an issue that needs sanction attention, but do they have experience in determining sanctions and when sanctions should be placed?
No, they do not.
So I don't misunderstand this bill then, probably. I thought I was not getting it because it seems to me that we don't have the Ontario Provincial Police or City Police doing recommendations on certain things. They have an activity they're responsible for within their legislation and within the separation of government from policing operations or from an individual or an independent arm of government such as FINTRAC. So I'm not mistaking this.
No, RCMP, like Department of National Defense and CSIS and other intelligence agencies, do provide information that it can be the basis for our activities, but they don't make decisions. That's
should be. I mean, we must get the Security Establishment Committee, whatever that is. What's it called? CSE. Not NSICOP, the CSE and and CSIS, RCMP, FINTRAC are all sources of information, but the decision-making activity would be at Global Affairs Canada.
In fact, Minister of Foreign Affairs specifically, and Cabinet.
On your recommendation to an ordering council. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We go next to Monsieur Duceppe. You have 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Est-ce que...
Thank you, Chair. So do you have any examples of what's happening internationally in terms of this kind of legislation? Does it exist internationally? And where it does exist, what's working well and what doesn't work well? So I don't mean authoritarian countries that control information. Have you examined what happens elsewhere or not? So when a sanction has been imposed, the U.S. and other countries have a tool under human rights to have sanctions that are broader and not just related to one country. So I don't know if my colleagues can talk about two other elements related to human rights. So the issues that we raised for the Broadcasting Act, that is in C-219 in terms of annual reports, is that done elsewhere internationally? It's not a trap. I just want to know. I'm looking at my colleagues. I don't think we know about it happening elsewhere. So I would have to do a bit of research on that. Yes, we'll do it also. Sometimes we're counting on you to do our work for us. But in this case, we will go search for that information. I sense that you're very reticent with C219 with the text, but there are many parliamentarians who supported this in order for it to get to committee here. So is there maybe not there a bit of a dissonance between the people working at the department, so you and the parliamentarians who wanted this to be studied in a committee? Yes, possibly. There are a lot of details that we haven't discussed today. In depth are procedural issues in terms of the reports. And so we already have a lot of work to carry out research, to work with allies, to prepare our documents to prepare for court cases. So adding all of this makes our life more difficult.
All of us. We will now briefly suspend the hearing in order to prepare for our next panel. Thank you. I call this meeting to order. I would now like to welcome our witness for the second panel. From the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, Brandon Silver, Director of Policy and Projects. Welcome. I now invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. C'est un grand plaisir de témoigner sur le projet de loi.
It's a pleasure for me to talk about Bill C-219. I'd like to thank MP James Bizan for having introduced this important bill, as well as the government for its expression of support in general. This approach demonstrates the spirit of unanimity that marked the initial adoption of the Magnitsky Act in 2017.
And Professor Erwin Kotler had first proposed Magnitsky Bill C-339 as a parliamentarian in 2011. In 2013, co-founded and headed the Interparliamentary Group for Justice for Sergei Magnitsky. In 2015, proposed unanimous consent motion that was adopted calling for Magnitsky legislation. And again in 2015, proposed a global Magnitsky bill. And in 2016, offered emphatic support for the important legislation spearheaded by Senator Andrzejczuk and MP James Bizan. We are pleased to again offer strong support and endorsement of Bill C-219. I will focus my remarks on what we consider to be some of the particularly essential elements of this bill. First, in changing the short title of the Special Economic Measures Act to the Sergei Magnitsky Global Sanctions Act not only honors the sacrifice of Sergei Magnitsky, but reflects the reality of our sanctions regime. Human rights violations and corruption would not be sanctionable offenses under CIMA if not for the adoption of the 2017 Magnitsky Law amendments. So, of the 1,042 human rights sanctions implemented by Canada since these amendments in 2017, 962 of them are under CIMA. So 92% of our country's Magnitsky-style human rights sanctions are not actually implemented under the Magnitsky Law. Over 35 countries now have a Magnitsky Act, so in an increasingly dangerous and divided world, this simple title change will help streamline collaboration and end confusion amongst our allies and civil society around the world, and reflects the reality of how the Canadian government has implemented our human rights sanctions frameworks thus far. Second, expanding visa bans to immediate family members fills an important gap in current legislation. Grave human rights abusers often like to send their families abroad to enjoy the freedoms that they deny their citizens at home. This legislation would close the door on their family members enjoying the banks, businesses, beaches in Canada, and thereby also protect our sovereignty from the corrupt and corrosive effect of this foreign capital. It enhances our national security, the integrity of our banking systems, protects our borders, and is in line with what our allies have themselves integrated into their sanctions legislation, and in fact is somewhat more narrow. What was shared earlier by the important and hard-working civil service leaders, I would just want to comment that their assertion around dependent family members does not reflect the practice of allies. The European Union uses associated family members, which actually goes beyond dependents, and the United States as well goes beyond dependent family members. And I would encourage the committee to therefore go beyond defining immediate family members as only those who are dependent. And third, the provision on prisoners of conscience will provide a life-saving spotlight to them. For the dissident suffering in the darkness of a dictator's dungeon, this legislation would shine a light on their case that could help secure their freedom. Vladimir Kara-Murza's Newfound Freedom from Putin's Gulags provides a case study. The public disclosure surrounding advocacy on his case, working with his wife Evgenia, and undertaking efforts like sanctioning the officials responsible for his unjust imprisonment, our ambassador holding a press conference on the steps of the courthouse during his unfair trial, and granting him honorary Canadian citizenship helped free him. And I commend the essential work of this committee in a multi-partisan way that helped ensure he is alive and free today.
Thank you.
Upon his release, Vladimir Kara-Murza, like all prisoners of conscience we have advocated for, told us that these public activities from governments and parliaments kept him alive. It told him, and it told his jailers, that he was not forgotten. Beyond individual cases, the prisoner of conscience provision is essential for data and deterrence. GAC's annual consular report makes no mention of arbitrary detention and hostage-taking. A Canadian prisoner of conscience is lumped together with a murderer, thereby equating crimes committed against Canadians by foreign states with crimes committed by Canadians in foreign states. If there were clear metrics about detentions of prisoners of conscience, and particularly Canadians held abroad, this would inform the travel decisions of Canadians and perhaps even lighten the load on consular affairs that they reference. Perhaps less Canadians would travel to the jurisdictions where there are rising rates of prisoners of conscience, and it would perhaps be helpful to Canadians to have this information at hand.
Thank you. We'll have to conclude. Thank you so much for your statement. We will begin the period of questions, beginning with MP Bezan. You have 6 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. And, I may split my time with Mr. Chong. Thank you. You want to take it? No, go ahead. Okay. I don't know how. I thought the ad was going to go first, but anyway, thank you so much, Mr. Silver, for the support of the organization. Make sure you give Professor Kotler our best. His leading edge work on Magnitsky sanctions will always be immortalized in Parliament, and we will always recognize how hard he's worked in support of standing up for human rights and being such a strong leader. He's an inspiration to each and every one of us. I'm glad you brought up the importance of why we want to make sure we shine the spotlight on prisoners of conscience and human rights defenders, as the department likes to call it. Can you just talk more about what's happening now with hostage diplomacy that we're starting to witness from China and others, and how it's important that we continue to have these transparent reporting to ensure that this type of practice stops?
Sure. Thank you very much for that timely and important question. And the rapid rise of state hostage-taking and arbitrary detention perhaps merits a reconsideration of current approaches to better address this situation. So having worked on a number of such cases, hand in hand with the hard-working, folks in consular affairs, and want to commend the government on establishing a special hostage department, which was a necessary step, but more can be done. I would suggest perhaps 3 amendments that can help reflect this in the prisoner of conscience section. A, mandating that the information on the numbers of prisoners of conscience in a country that this legislation proposes actually be included in the travel advisories issued by GAC. So beyond, the public disclosures, right now it's at times, in the Jimmy Lai's case, for example, travel advisory, was issued that Hong Kong can quote unquote have the arbitrary application of local laws, and that Canadians traveling there for business or tourism should take that into consideration. This can be a potential way of protecting Canadians from being targeted abroad, and again, alleviating some of the burden on GAC. B, that the arbitrary detention and torture of prisoners of conscience in general, and of Canadians in particular, perhaps be added as a standalone sanctionable offense. So the TNR additions are essential if we're adding sections to the Magnitsky Law, specifically talking about the targeting of prisoners of conscience, and the hostage-taking of Canadians can be immensely helpful. And third, and this is drawing from Professor Kotler's bill that he proposed in 2010, Bill C-554, an act to protect Canadians abroad, shifting the suggestion about public disclosures to be contingent on the requests of families, but not in a discretionary manner, that pursuant to Articles 19 and 20 of Bill C-554, that there could actually be a right of mandamus, where Canadian family members want actions by the Canadian government. They should be able to demand that. So we would actually suggest that the public reporting requirements of this bill, not only do we support that, but that could be expanded to actually give a right to families to demand that of the government. And again,
Thank you for those recommendations. I'm going to give the rest of my time to Mr. Chung.
How much time it remains?
2 minutes and 20 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to focus on one of the purposes of the bill, which concerns the Broadcasting Act. The government effectively took RT off the airwaves in Canada in 2021 through a cabinet directive issued under Section 15 of the Broadcasting Act. CGTN continues to operate. I know that in the United Kingdom, I believe in 2021, Ofcom pulled CGTN off the airwaves, their CRTC, because they concluded that CGTN's broadcast editorial direction was coming from the Chinese Communist Party and the authoritarian state of the PRC. So can you tell us what other democracies have pulled either RT or CGTN off their airwaves, and the method by which they did that?
I can seek to undertake to revert back with that information, but more broadly would just want to comment that there's a very clear nexus between the object of this bill to combat transnational repression and the elements of the bill that are therefore seeking to limit the ability of foreign regimes to conduct foreign influence and foreign interference via their broadcasting. So we'd be broadly supportive.
And I concur with that assessment. It would be helpful if you could send the committee that information. It would be helpful as we seek to amend that section of the bill. I'd also note, in support of what you just said, that Ofcom also concluded that the airing of a forced confession of Simon Cheng, the former official at the United Kingdom consulate in Hong Kong, was a gross violation of human rights, but also breach their licensing code. So I think that's important for the record to show as well that that these authoritarian state-controlled broadcasters, have done some pretty egregious things and are acting at the editorial direction of the CCP and the PRC. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Abdelhak Sari. You have 6 minutes. Sorry.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank
Merci
you,
beaucoup.
Chair. And also, thank you, Mr. Silver. This is very relevant for me because it's the first question that I'm asking in this committee. And Canada is recognized internationally as having very clear positions on serious infringement of human rights for Bill C-219. So in order that people will understand very clearly, those who are listening, what is the greatest contribution here to reinforce Canada's position in that way? Thank you for this important question. I think that the elements of legislation that are aimed at prisoners of conscience, they're giving the government more tools to be able to implement sanctions. It's not just a question of giving more powers, more tools to government. It's also sharing the message with the world, with the victims and to the violators of human rights, that Canada commits and its foreign policy is rooted in human rights. So it's not only a question of process, but also an issue of communications. So that this message is clear, and it's important in that way. And in the changes that are proposed for the people who are listening to us, if we want to talk about a concrete impact, a tangible impact, what would the most concrete and tangible impact would be? So thank you very much. If I had to choose one, at first sight. It's the change of the criteria for the implementation of sanctions in order to include transnational repression and to create a definition of this. And secondly, the definition of a prisoner of conscience is of which the government is asking to make reports. So until now, the public and the families did not have access to this kind of information. So the public broadcasting of this information could help Canadians to take better decisions when they're traveling for pleasure or for business. And it also communicates to governments who will take Canadians hostage, who will seize or imprison prisoners of conscience, that there are consequences.
If we are publicly disclosing this information, it not only protects Canadians and informs them, but it has a deterrent effect on the imprisoning countries and holds them to account. A lot of them care about their reputation abroad. They're dependent on tourism and on business transactions, and this could hopefully encourage some behavior change there beyond sanctions themselves.
Si on voit le projet de loi comme il est, généralement...
We look at the bill as it is. We say we want it to have more teeth, to be more, to be stronger. Do you think it goes far enough in that respect, or are there things that should be added so that it might be stronger? Thank you. I had a few suggestions of amendments. So in certain aspects, it's a question of interpretation. And if we have clearer definitions, as we do in terms of sanctions against family members of someone who has been sanctioned, it makes it stronger. So I want to repeat our position that a member of the close family has to go further than a dependent of the family, as our allies have done. And we have many court decisions. We should not be afraid that it will go to court. It was already fought in the courts in the U.S. and in the European Union and in our courts in Canada. Refers to decisions in third country democracies.
Inform these interpretations and evidence. I would encourage a more expansive approach to definition of family members, which again will protect our own sovereignty and economy from the corrosive effects of this corrupt foreign capital. And secondly, again, I would underscore, the rights of families. I think that that's incredibly important, that, we take a victim-centric approach. Again, as counsel to political prisoners, hostages, family members, the common thread between all these cases is that they want more public action and more ability to engage with the government in that regard, and having some, embedded protections in the legislation that would encourage and allow for that, I think would be most welcome.
Ce qu'on n'aime pas, c'est d'avoir vraiment aussi des projets de loi ou des lois.
Don't like is to have bills that are only symbolic. Do you think that we would need more legislation or more will to make it stronger? Was it a legislative problem or a problem of willingness? I think efficient action needs both. The more tools we give ourselves, the more we can get the government committed.
Of legislation creates the context that can catalyze action, but having the correct tools in a more narrow procedural sense and in a substantive sense, I think, goes well beyond just rhetoric. Again, the rhetoric's important, and I think some of the symbolic aspects of this law are essential, but it goes beyond symbolism and, changes some of the triggering thresholds for the implementation of sanctions. It embeds definitions of political, of prisoners of conscience with reporting requirements. There's a lot of highly substantive and procedural additions in this law that will not only empower action, but hopefully encourage more of the discretionary movement that you've alluded to.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Duceppe. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur Silver. Rebonjour.
Mr. Silver, you're often here with us. We have to give you a pass for the committee, and I think your expertise in Bill C-219 is obvious with the work that your organization does. I'd like to ask some broader questions. Earlier, I talked with the officials from GAC. So the bill is asking for an annual report where there's a disclosure that would give more visibility to the prisoners of conscience. But in your experience, is the disclosure of information about prisoners something that could expose their family to harms? It's always a decision that's made in each case for deciding what information can be disclosed, which would help the case and not harm it.
Family members against those seeking to support political prisoner cases. Whether it's the council of, prisoners of conscience being targeted, their family members. This is a rising trend, so it's an important question. But ultimately, the release and dissemination of information provides a protective cover, and it should be up to the family members whether this information is released. If there is, and again, I believe that this bill actually already embeds the correct safeguards. There is a mention of exceptions where the minister feels that this information shouldn't be disclosed or it could cause harm. It wouldn't be, but by default, more public reporting can be helpful, and we found in cases that has more often than not led to the releases. Again, this critical mass of pressure on the imprisoning regimes that encourages them to realize it would cost them more to keep this prisoner of conscience in prison than to release them.
Je suis d'accord avec vous pour avoir participé à plusieurs.
So I agree with you. I've worked on a few cases like this, often with press conferences or where all of the parties in the House are joined together to somebody we think of Raif Badawi, Jimmy Lai, and others, and Mirza as well. But in the text, my question, I want to repeat it. I'm not in favor of one option or another, but in the text currently what we have is that it is up to the minister to decide to disclose or not the information, whereas some people, and I'm wondering, should we not ask for a model that would be based on prior consent of the families before the minister would have their word? So would it be wise to publish information or not? And it's not really expressed in C-219. Would it be useful to have that as an amendment? First of all, thank you for your commitment for all these prisoners of conscience throughout the world, and your contribution is in those cases where the prisoners were liberated or their conditions were improved. As I referred to in my opening statement, I think
those victims imprisoned abroad and their family members should be the driving force of this. A victim-centered approach would be the most appropriate. And again, shifting the burden from what the minister may feel should be done in a particular case or another, regardless of family concern, not to be rather the family's wishes, that if the family wants this information made public, wants certain government interventions, that should be the default, and that they should even be allowed to apply for a mandamus to compel government action. I think perhaps would suggest that some Canadians could have gotten home even sooner if the government would have decided to speak out earlier.
Peut-être une dernière question, je pense qu'il me reste.
Maybe one last question. I think I still have a minute or so. I'll speak more broadly. You talked about international jurisdictions that do things differently. How would C-219 bring us closer to what's being done internationally? I think it would bring us closer to what's happening. I'm proud that the Canadian Parliament in a multi-partite effort makes it so we don't follow our allies.
Every other country followed what Canada did. We were the first to implement sanctions in the case of arbitrary detention. We're the first country to give him honorary citizenship. So, yes, there are things that our allies are doing that can be reflected in legislation, as I suggested earlier, when it comes to, the definition of immediate family, for example. But I think we can go beyond that. This is an opportunity for Canada to be a leader in global Magnitsky sanctions. The bill, as it stands already, makes important contributions in that regard. And some of the suggested amendments, like adding to TNR, prisoners of conscience in that, given that prisoners of conscience are already in the bill, having that be a, triggering threshold, the arbitrary detention of Canadians abroad, those are kinds of things that I think, apropos some of the earlier questions about the rise of global hostage taking, that can really help ensure Canada is a leader in that. And again, I think the public reporting requirements are essential, and other countries are doing some good things on that. Again, the U.S., I think, in a bipartisan way, has, pursued a lot of important, legislation, executive orders in that regard. We can go beyond that and, encourage the world to follow Canada's leadership, as we did in the Kara-Murza case, in a multi-partisan way.
Thank you very much. I will start a very quick lightning round of 3 minutes each, beginning with MP Ziad Abou Taif. You have 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Silver. Welcome to committee again. I'm just interested in knowing the existing sanctions regime in Canada. How do you believe that the procedures for sanction entities with demonstrated acts of transnational repression, is it effective? And where do you believe that we are vulnerable in this regard?
I'm sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Yes, the question is, do you believe the existing sanction system we have in Canada is effective enough, and whether, where are we vulnerable in the whole process?
Sure. Well, there's been a question of enforcement in Canada's current sanctions laws. So, relative to, on a per capita basis, Canada is actually one of the leaders in sanctions implementation, but are lacking in enforcement. And one of the suggestions of the bill I think helps fill one of those gaps and deficiencies. A lot of the sanctioned individuals often evade those sanctions by using their family members to do so. By adding in, visa bans on immediate family members, we're helping to close some of those gaps. So that's one, easy reference in terms of gaps in existing legislation that this law helps to fill. And certainly when it comes to transnational repression, some of the specific acts enumerated aren't covered under the current law, and at the very least, or I should say may not be covered under the current law, and both ensures that the tools are there and encourages government action to use them.
Do you see any fundamental reasons that deterring us or not preventing us from going further on the strengthening the sanction system, and especially on the implementation part of it?
No, and actually, I think, it didn't get much reference in some of the earlier exchanges, but I want to specifically point out the part of Bill C-219 that mandates government responses to requests for sanctions from the committee. That is an important act of transparency. It has a parallel to existing frameworks in the Magnitsky Law. So currently, parliamentarians can pass a motion to repeal sanctions, but can't pass a motion to implement sanctions. So there's a bit of an incongruity there. So I think this bill actually helps to fix that and make sure that, parliamentarians can encourage the government to do so. And I would add that it doesn't put a significant burden on the government. It's enshrining in legislation what can potentially be done creatively with order paper questions, but in a much more sort of transparent, democratically oriented way that, again, parallels existing sanctions removal mechanisms in the current legislation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Clark. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Silver, thank you for being here today. And obviously, your organization's been dealing with these issues for well over a decade, a long time. So congratulations on all the work that you've done in this regard. I wanted to ask you if you were the previous hour, we touched a bit on terms and kind of prisoners of conscience, which is the term used in C-219 and then human rights defenders. And you may have heard that there was some discussion about the fact that perhaps human rights defenders is a term that might capture other individuals that would otherwise be excluded under this legislation. I'm just wondering if you had a point of view on those terms and how we might balance them to be most effective.
Sure. Thank you very much, both for your kind words and very incisive question. So I would only comment that in relation to some of the discussions about human rights defenders versus prisoners of conscience, all human rights defenders arbitrarily detained abroad are prisoners of conscience under the definitions that were proposed. But not all prisoners of conscience are human rights defenders. So I would assert that the prisoner of conscience definition is actually broader and better suits the intentions of the bill and of Canada's human rights foreign policy. And I'll give you two concrete examples of cases we've worked on as an institution that would be excluded if the definition was shifted from prisoner of conscience to human rights defender. One, we've represented Baha'i, members of the Baha'i faith, like the Iran, who are persecuted and imprisoned in Iran and Yemen, for example. They self-describe as prisoners of conscience. They do not engage in human rights defender activity. They would be excluded. Another one, Canada has been an important leader when it comes to protecting LGBTQ persons. Just 3 days ago, a group of LGBT people were imprisoned in Russia. They would be excluded if the definition were changed to human rights defender. People who are targeted simply for immutable characteristics and their identity would be covered under prisoners of conscience. They would likely not be covered under human rights defender.
And I have a short period of time, but I wanted to ask quickly about transnational repression as well. Obviously, that's a concept that's become more relevant or more prominent in recent years. In your view, what's proposed in this bill? How does that compare and contrast with what peer countries might be doing? And is there anything you would like to see added or adjusted on that issue in particular?
Sure. This is a nascent area of growing concern. And again, like our sanctions legislation more broadly, is an opportunity for Canada to lead. The specific acts enumerated in this bill and in the definition would hopefully give the government greater authority to take action in these types of situations. There was the important G7 statements that were initiated by Canada, and the compendium that was put together under Canada's chairmanship of the G7, a further joint statement led by Canada of 14 countries about transnational repression, targeting human rights defenders, Jewish citizens, former ministers, including the founder and chair of our center. And therefore, there might be an opportunity there when this legislation is further considered to move to coordinate with allies. There's, reference to, and again, I think it's important amendments this bill makes to working with allies, and it references, NATO, for example. I think the proactive use of this legislation to counter TNR can be done unilaterally and should be, but in particular done in concert with allies. That we could be leading in NATO, leading in the G7, as we have on TNR as a thematic concept, to ensure coordination of sanctions implementations with allies.
Thank you very much. We go finally to Monsieur Duceppe. You have 3 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais vous poser
Thank you, Chair. I'll ask you one question, Mr. Silver, and if you have other comments that you want to add using the time that's left to us, please feel free to do that. Currently, you're working in one way when you want to present one or more prisoners of conscience. If C-219 is adopted, as we hope, what will it change in your work as someone who represents those people, be it at the political level, the media level, or the legal level?
I think will be a game changer in shifting public conceptions around arbitrary detention, whether it's prisoners of conscience globally or of Canadians in particular. The greater transparency that this will inject into processes is something that we can leverage to improve prison conditions of prisoners and even help secure their freedom. Again, would encourage that the prisoner of conscience definition and public reporting be embedded, into the sanctions triggers as well, and that some of the public reporting even be expanded as we've suggested. The bill itself, again, adds important transparency, democratic principles that could be leveraged in individual representation and in those emblematic cases where, the freedom of one person can have a positive impact in encouraging the freedom of so many others whose cases and causes they represent, like Jimmy Lai and like Vladimir Kara-Murza did.
À ce moment-là, ça pourrait devenir peut-être un modèle pour d'autres.
So it could maybe become a model for other allied countries who would want to achieve the same goals as we wish to with C219.
Played a leadership role in many regards, and this is a chance for us to do so again. And it's encouraging that the work of this committee on, whether it's been on, previous iterations of, Magnitsky Law, so the first one and then its amendments, or on countering arbitrary detention, hostage taking, advocating for political prisoners, that these have been rare issues, not only of agreement, but of unanimity. The fact that Magnitsky Law was passed unanimously in 2017, that the honorary citizenship for Vladimir Kara-Murza was adopted unanimously, that Mr. Lai's case was supported unanimously. I think these are issues of common cause that, bring Canadians together, and that, reflect your own leadership in having come together on this. And it's very gratifying as, civil society organizations to see that and hope that this here too, C219 will be a place of coming together for the sake of global justice and human rights.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the committee, I want to thank you for your appearance and for your answers to the questions. We will now briefly suspend in order to go into in-camera session.
you.